Hello and welcome once more to the lovely Cornish countryside. Today I believe we're off to Kynance Cove, which is going to be awesome, but before that I want to talk a little bit about software development. I want to talk about the talk that I gave at PHP South West on April the 11th. This talk was titled Whether or Not to Use a Framework, or to use a framework or not. I want to pick on a particular point. The first couple of slides, they were really about the perspective of the learner's perspective, and also the perspective of using a framework within a production environment. Now, a lot of people learn programming through a framework. That might sound a little bit odd, but quite a few people do that. In my opinion, that isn't the best way to learn a programming language, because you are learning the language through the implementation of the framework. But how many people have you heard say, oh, you know, I'm going to learn JavaScript this week, so I'm going to start building something in Vue.js or React or Angular, that kind of thing. And the thing is, they're not really learning the language. They are learning the language through the eyes of the framework. And of course, every framework does things quite differently. Personally, I find learning through a framework is actually a hindrance, because you're detached from the language. You can't understand how the language works. You're understanding how the language is interpreted by that particular framework, but you can't transfer those skills very easily from one framework to the other framework, because they do things completely differently. And I think this is why I have so many sort of basic beginner tutorials on my channel. I try not to jump straight into the learning of a framework, even though they're the most trendy things. The thing is, us developers, we are extremely magpie-like. We like the new shiny toys. So when a new framework comes out, sometimes we jump on it, regardless of what the project actually needs or requires. And there's so many different types of frameworks. I mentioned in my talk the differences between, say, micro frameworks and monolithic frameworks, but also, of course, you have frameworks specifically for different types of applications. You might have frameworks specifically tailored towards e-commerce shopping carts, or static site generators, or a whole bunch of stuff, right? So you want to identify the problems that your application has, and then try and choose a framework that fits one of those things. But the thing is, it's not a bad thing to just roll your own. Obviously, that you need to think about that, obviously, because that requires a lot of work. And I'm not going to be talking about rolling your own in this video, perhaps in another one. I did mention it in my talk though. But frameworks, it's a point that I see a lot of people just say, oh, I'm going to dive in to programming and I'm going to learn this framework and not the language, or I'm going to learn this language through that framework. And I think that is a dangerous thing, especially for beginner programmers, or beginner web developers, because the thing is, they get so isolated in that framework. Yes, they learn the framework, and yes, they understand how that framework does something, but when they perhaps come into the actual industry, when they're actually being paid to do the stuff, that framework might not be there. And also, it's very difficult when the framework moves on, when it goes from one version to the next, because you are therefore supporting a legacy application. And yes, I do understand why a lot of people jump onto the framework bandwagon, because of the community behind it, because of the documentation behind it. These guys and girls who want to learn programming, or want to build an application, they see it from the requirements point of view. They go, oh, okay, I want to build a contact form, I want to build some sort of like e-commerce thing, I want to build a login form, a sign-up form, registration form, and that kind of thing. And then in the community, in the framework community, in the cookbooks and the documentation, it describes how to do those things, those individual things, in great detail, using that framework, which is fantastic. You don't necessarily get that in the languages documentation, because the language documentation is specific to the language. So the language is going to be talking about control flows and constructs and variables and arrays and lists and dictionaries and all of that kind of jazz, rather than how you can use those things to build other bits and pieces. Now, I certainly don't want to come across as the framework hater, the person who just doesn't like frameworks. I love frameworks. I use Symfony quite a bit. I use Flask quite a bit with Python. The frameworks are great, but you just have to think about why it is you're using a framework. One of the questions I think needs to be, and one of the questions that I think just doesn't get asked a lot, is it going to improve me as a developer, or is it going to improve the project? Is it what the project needs, or is it what I need to develop my career? And that is a really tough question, because of course, if you're just developing yourself and not the application, then your heart's not really in it for that project. Which is another thing, a completely different topic that we'll probably talk about later on, when your heart really isn't in the project that you're developing, but you're only doing it to develop yourself. I'll probably splice this video with some of the slides that I was talking about at PHP South West. Also, that talk was recorded, so when that does come up, then I will certainly link it to this video as well, and any other video that I mention about that talk. The talk was 10 minutes long, so there is a fair amount of content in there. We go through, like I said, the production perspective as well, so when you're building something for production, it's a completely different mindset to when you're actually learning a language, because when you're learning a language, obviously you're able to experiment, and you're encouraged to fail. You're encouraged to try things out and break things, see how things work. Obviously you don't want to be doing that in production, because that's the last thing you want to do, is break something in production. So I'll leave the notes and the slides and the links to all of those kind of things down in the description below. But right now, today, we are going to go off to Kynance. I'm going to leave you with some footage from Kynance Cove as we did the coastal walk. Thanks for watching, happy coding, I'll see you again next time. Cheers, bye.